Hey nerds, what's up? Today I wanted to talk about two book series that are often compared, which is The First Law by Joe Abercrombie and A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Usually, if you love A Song of Ice and Fire, the First Law trilogy is what is recommended next, and I just want to talk a little bit about my opinions on the similarities between the two. Now, I think why these have been linked is because Joe Abercrombie himself lists A Song of Ice and Fire as a huge inspiration for his First Law series. In a blog post where he talks about his inspirations, he says a lot about Song of Ice and Fire. I'll link that below so you can read the whole thing, but one passage in particular I really like states, "It was also interesting from a technical standpoint. Martin uses the third-person limited approach, as it's called, with the events always narrated from inside the head, if you like, of one of the main characters. All the action is seen powerfully close up, colored by the personality of the narrator. For me, fantasy went suddenly from being all about the huge, the spectacular, the sweeping wide shot, following on from Tolkien's approach, to being about the experience of the individuals. You feel the sweat, the pain, the fear, the blood. You understand the motivations. You see how no one is a villain in their own mind, even if they are in everyone else's. The great achievement of Martin's books, for me, is that they cover vast, epic, immense events, but never lose the sense of tight involvement with the characters. It wasn't a new approach in wider fiction. I guess Tolstoy was doing something similar in War and Peace, but it was the first time I'd seen it applied so rigorously and effectively in fantasy, and it seems now to have become pretty much the standard method of narration in the genre." I think this is a pretty good explanation of how Abercrombie and Martin's works are similar, and we're gonna get into that as I go into my different sections that I want to compare them in. In case you're unfamiliar with either series, A Song of Ice and Fire, or better known now by its show title, Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, currently consists of 5 books: A Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, A Storm of Sword, A Feast for Crows, and A Dance with Dragons, with 2 unreleased books that are planned to finish the series, Winds of Winter and A Dream for Spring. Joe Abercrombie's The First Law series is a newer series that consists of 10 books, first a trilogy, then 3 standalones and a short story collection, and then ends on another trilogy. A lot of people skip the short story collection, so you can technically not count it, but it's about 9 or 10 books and it is completed. My relationship to both of these series is that I really love them. They are both in my top 10 series of all time. Of course, I more am in love with A Song of Ice and Fire. It has catapulted to my second favorite of all time, so it is higher than The First Law, but I enjoy these series both a lot and completely understand why they're often recommended in lieu of each other. So today I'm gonna go through a few key elements that I think are interesting in comparing them, including use of magic, the grimdarkness of it all, character voice, explicitness, and humor. So this video could be useful for you if you've only read one of the series and you want to know if you'll enjoy the other, or if you've read both series, you can see if you agree with me on the comparisons. And with that, I'll see you after the jump. So the first thing I planned on talking about is character voice, and it is indicative of the quote I chose from Abercrombie that clearly that is one of the big things that Abercrombie took away from A Song of Ice and Fire, and in my opinion is the thing that really cements the two. I will say about The First Law, I think it is an excellent example of a series that clearly was inspired by its source material, but in a way that never ever feels repetitive or like it is stealing from it. I think if I hadn't known, well, first of all, I did these in a weird order. I feel like probably most people experienced A Song of Ice and Fire first, whereas I did First Law first. And I knew already going into A Song of Ice and Fire that Abercrombie had been inspired by it, and I could clearly see how he was inspired by it. But it never felt like referential, which I think is a big deal because I do read a lot of things that are inspired by other things that maybe are a little too close to home. I did read Empire of Silence, Sun Eater. Okay, you know what book I'm talking about. Recently, and although I really enjoyed that book, I did think its Dune inspirations were a little on the nose. I know it gets better throughout the series, so it didn't like hurt the series for me, but it was very on the nose. You didn't need to tell me. I think Abercrombie just does it a little bit more elegantly the way he takes his inspiration, so I think that is a huge positive. But back to character voice, I do completely see, particularly here, how it is inspired. If you love George R.R. Martin's deep way of connecting you to characters and the way that he does character voice and motivations, Abercrombie has that in spades, and if anything, might be known a little bit more for it. Abercrombie was the first book I read where I started a chapter and knew it was a character we had not met before within the first sentence simply because of the voice. And that was shocking to me. I had never experienced that before First Law, and it was such a testament to me about how clearly Abercrombie could write from certain perspectives. And because of that, his character work is just unmatched. Now, if you've watched all my A Song of Ice and Fire reviews, you will know a similar thing happened to me in book 5 of A Song of Ice and Fire. So I do think Martin still has it. It did it, but yes, one thing you love about Song of Ice and Fire or First Law is that character voice, you're gonna get that from both series, and they are both so excellent at that. Next up is use of magic. So Abercrombie does credit A Game of Thrones for showing him that fantasy can be fantasy light and really not have a lot of magic in it and still be a fantasy series. This one is interesting for me because I actually think A Song of Ice and Fire has a lot more magic than people give it credit for. And I was surprised that Joe Abercrombie stated that so heavily as an influence. I think from what I've heard, again, I haven't seen the show, I think the show has given it a reputation of being a lot lower magic than it really is. Because I went into A Song of Ice and Fire thinking there would be like no magic, because everyone's like, it's barely fantasy, there's just some dragons. There's a lot of magic in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's just, yes, it is not Tolkien-esque magic. And I think that's what Abercrombie meant, is at the time that A Song of Ice and Fire was being initially published, it probably was very low fantasy. That being said, I don't want to do spoilers in this video, but a lot of pretty magical stuff happens in that series. I think because it's framed within such realistic, character motivations and war plots that it feels less fantastical. I think it does. All that to say, when we're comparing them, Joe Abercrombie's series is much less magical than A Song of Ice and Fire, in my opinion, totally clearly. Particularly because one theme of the First Law the First Law series as a whole is that magic is leaving the world. And it is very clear as you go through the 10 books in the series, seeing that ebb of magic leaving the world and coming closer and closer to the world we know now. It is a significant theme. I understand that in A Song of Ice and Fire, magic is also leaving the world. It has a different flavor. I feel that in A Song of Ice and Fire, that is a very background theme. It is clearly something that is happening when you think of the children of the forest. That took me a second to think of that word. Children of the forest and the gods and other things. I do think we're seeing an ebb, clearly, of magic. In Abercrombie's First Law series, that takes a forefront. It is very clear, it is a major plot point. So that's neither good nor bad. It just is. So if one of those things was important to you in either series, I think they are handled differently in both series. Next up, I want to talk about humor, which is something I think is missing from a lot of these conversations, and something I read in a blog post when I did my Grimdark research on my video ages ago. And I'm gonna try to track down the blog post so I could put the quote on screen. But it talked about how Grimdark-ness has lost a lot of its humor, which has been, in this author's opinion, a detriment to the subgenre. And I do agree with that, because Abercrombie and Martin, who are known a lot as like the kings of Grimdark, actually use quite a bit of humor in their books. Martin is funnier than I think people give him credit for. I laugh a lot at his quotations. However, Abercrombie does have him beat here. Abercrombie's hilarious. If you haven't read The First Law, peak comedy all the time, which is hilarious because it is a very dark series. We're going to talk about Grimdark in a second. It's an extremely dark series, but I also laughed a ton. Abercrombie is excellent at using very real parts of human nature, very funny, everyday things, and knowing just how to pinpoint them and write them in the truest, realest, funniest way. And he excels at that. So if you like humor mixed in, you're gonna love The First Law, I think, because it's an excellent element. Martin, on the other hand, while I do think he is very funny, it is not as much as the forefront as Abercrombie. So I do think it balances that out, because as we move into my next section, Grimdark, I have stated this on so many videos in passing, but I wanted to give it its daylight right here, which is that I don't think A Song of Ice and Fire is quite as grim as everybody makes it out to be, whereas The First Law earns its reputation. I think The First Law is much grimmer than A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, The First Law is finished as a series, so I know it's ending. I do not know A Song of Ice and Fire's ending. Maybe it will end on such a grim note, I will take this back. However, I've said it in the past and I stand by it, I would be shocked if A Song of Ice and Fire ended on a super grim note. I think in the series it is very evident, based on even little things, keeping this high level to keep it unspoilery, like the legacy of the North and how people rally around the North. Another example would be the character arc for Jaime Lannister, that George does have a little bit of hope, does have a little bit of some classic hero's journey in his writing, even though he is twisting it, even though he is changing it. Even the character of Ned Stark, you have these characters that are trying to improve, and the narrative right now does not tell me that that is impossible for them. Even the title of the final book, A Dream for Spring, implies to me that the book will probably be devastating, but end on a hopeful note, a dream of the future. The First Law, as a warning, has a grim outlook for the future. And it starts grim, its middle is grim, and it ends grim. As I explored a while ago in my video on the First Law trilogy, there is an anti-hero's journey in those books where our characters are doing the opposite of what a hero's journey would do. Even if they're trying to improve, they can never get there. That is kind of the analysis I made of that series, and I made that after only reading the first 3 books, and I think it really holds true for the whole 10 books. So that is a consideration to take if you've only read one of the series, particularly if you're coming from A Song of Ice and Fire, that you will find the First Law to be grimmer. Like, I think point blank, it is a grimmer story. Finally, I wanted to touch briefly on explicitness, because that's something I talk about a lot on my channel, just about my own reading habits. So if it's helpful for anyone else, I'd like to talk about it. I went back and forth on this one a lot. Which series is more explicit? It's like they're both more explicit in different ways. I want to say ultimately A Song of Ice and Fire is more explicit, but there are ways, so I'm just gonna break it down. Look, we'll just break it down. First, let's start with sex scenes. In Abercrombie's work, I would say word for word, his sex scenes are more explicit. However, tonally, they're so different than A Song of Ice and Fire that they feel less explicit. The reasoning is that all of Abercrombie's sex scenes are very funny. They are played for humor. They're not romance. I don't know how else to explain it. You would not call them spicy scenes, okay? If you called them that, someone would probably be very angry at you because that's not really their purpose in the story. I did skim some of them because they were just like more explicit than I personally like to read, but overall, they serve a very different purpose in the story, which makes me feel that A Song of Ice and Fire's sex scenes are more explicit because of the way they are described. I have talked about previously that I have a little bit of an issue with the way George Martin talks about women's bodies, and I don't really like that. And so because of that, they seem a little more explicit to me. They are much shorter usually than Abercrombie's, but they also are more frequent. Additionally, Abercrombie very rarely and very carefully talks about a sexual assault. It almost doesn't happen in his entire series. There's a couple small instances of it that I think are handled extremely well. I've talked about that in my other Joe Abercrombie series. It's one thing I'm very impressed by his writing is the way he handles that. So that is also obviously more prevalent in A Song of Ice and Fire as a theme. And so if that is something that is upsetting to you, it is something to know going into that. And I've covered that particularly in my first book review of Game of Thrones, if you need more details on that. As far as language, Abercrombie definitely takes the cake. Way more language in his series, so just FYI. Violence, I would say they're probably pretty comparable, with maybe A Song of Ice and Fire being slightly more violent, more viscerally violent, I think, in some of the scenes, but Abercrombie has tons of war and a lot of violent scenes too, so I'd say mostly the same there. I'd love to know if you've read both these series, what you think about them being compared. Ultimately, I would say it is a decent comparison. I would say the people who love A Song of Ice and Fire and don't like First Law generally are people who need a lot of plot. I don't agree that the First Law doesn't have a ton of plot, but it is definitely very character first, and particularly like the first Game of Thrones book is pretty fast paced. I would say Abercrombie's books feel more like a Clash of Kings in plot, where Clash of Kings was more of a build-up and a lot of character momentum. It's not like plot didn't happen. I just think that's personally more the pace of all the First Law books for the most part. Also, the reason First Law is lower down on my list is how depressing it is. I do like the little bit of hope in Martin's books. So that is why I think I am more attached to A Song of Ice and Fire, if I had to say. I also just fell in love with everything about A Song of Ice and Fire. So that's why I love it so much. I've been saying that a lot. But anyway, otherwise, I think they are a good recommendation. So if you love A Song of Ice and Fire, I would highly recommend First Law. I mean, I read all 10 books, so obviously I really enjoyed them. I will DNF a series. Like, I never DNF a book, but I will DNF a series at any moment if I'm like, this is just wasting my time. So the fact that I read all 10 books in a decently short period of time says something. If you want more details on how I feel about each First Law book, you can look at my First Law ranking, or you can look at either of my trilogy reviews. I also think I have some individual reviews. I'll put them down below. If you want to know what I think about A Song of Ice and Fire, is I loved it, but I also have reviews for each of those books if you want to know in particular. If you've read both series, I would love to know what you think about the comparison between the two, if you think it's good or bad, what you think of my opinion on how they compare in those 5 elements. If you've only read one series, tell me if you're going to plan on reading the other series, or if there's a reason you haven't. Maybe I could help you decide if it was right for you. And I guess other recommendations for if you like First Law or Song of Ice and Fire, other things you see recommended a lot. I want to know it all. And of course, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. If you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.